At any rate, I balk at the result. Photomolecular dissipation.
Cartoon!
This video took far longer than it should have, for reasons that I'm not particularly interested in getting into right now. But it's finally done! It's finally here! And we're finally going to get into this. After this, I can leave Ed, and Eddy behind for a while. I said some harsh things about this show in my top 10 worst episodes list, or at least aspects about it like the cankers. So let me be absolutely clear here. I love Ed, and Eddy. Of the cartoons, Courage the Cowardly Dog was my favorite, but Ed, and Eddy was definitely the runner-up. And that is some stiff competition. There were a dozen shows in that repertoire, almost all of them being classics. Powerpuff Girls, Dexter's Laboratory, Codename Kids Next Door, and over all of them, I would have picked Ed, and Eddy. Yeah, that's right, it's my most controversial opinion ever. I would have watched Ed, and Eddy over Mike, Lou, and Og any day of the week. I don't know if this is still true, but at one point, this show was the longest-running Cartoon Network show, with technically 6 seasons in a movie. I could go on and on with a lengthy interlude here, and talk about the characters being memorable or how it made my childhood days a little bit brighter. But let's be honest, Ed, and Eddy was just a funny show, and that's why we liked it. It could be creative, wild, wacky, and surreal, but more often than not, it was just out there to make you laugh. And there's nothing wrong with that. And since this review has taken so long, I think it would be very wise to get into it without any more further ado and delay. I'm pretty sure you guys would appreciate that. So, let's get into it. This is top 10 episodes of Ed, and Eddy.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
Did you see that?
What have I done? I've actually created a monster!
Let's start with something familiar. The Day the Ed Stood Still. I talked about this one a few years back. Actually, at this point, it's getting to be like half a decade, which scares me. But either way, I talked about this one back during a previous Halloween special, in the top 25 most disturbing episodes from kids' cartoons. I was almost considering making this list kind of like a Halloween special because this episode's on the list, as I am writing this entry before Halloween. But after a couple of battles with an inconsolable depression, some sore throats, and a bunch of existential dread, I'm fairly sure that this video is going to be coming out at some point in November. You know, if things go as planned this time. It's really weird. When it comes to the holiday specials of Ed, and Eddy, you're usually better off watching an episode that's not one of their holiday specials. I compared Fa La La Ed to Jingle Jingle Jangle a while back, and despite the latter not being made to be a Christmas special and having a ton of effort trying to invoke the holiday feeling, Fa La La Ed comes off as a much better Christmas special. And when it comes to Halloween, the effect is even greater. You don't watch Boo Ha Ha if you want to have a good time watching Ed, and Eddy. You watch The Day the Ed Stood Still. There are a few good episodes of Ed, and Eddy that go for more of a horror aesthetic. After all, being into monsters and science fiction is one of Ed's main character traits, so it's going to come up once in a while, and it's almost always a treat. In fact, I actually had a hard time picking which of these episodes was the best. There was the R-rated movie episode, which was one of the standout gems from the first season, and there was the episode with Ed's scam, that ended up being some kind of occult curse that he found in a comic book. And then there's the Alien special, of course, which left the series off with one final hurrah. But with all of them, The Day the Ed Stood Still holds the crown, I think. This episode invokes that feeling of a classic monster movie. In it, Ed dons a monster costume, and he goes completely native. This is probably going to sound weird, but it is a joy to just see everyone freaking out throughout the entire episode. It's one of the episodes that actually has the best overall atmosphere. You really get that horror feel, although, no, I wouldn't actually call this episode scary, obviously. It just follows the form of a horror movie. So I guess the question is, why is it so low on this list? Beyond the ending being a touch too gross for my tastes, it's not what I'd call the funniest episode of the series. Nowhere near it, actually. And this is going to be a bit of a pattern on the lower end of my list. Ed, and Eddy is primarily a comedy show, but what I look for in cartoons, or any stories really, is the story. Or at the very least, I like interesting concepts. Ed, and Eddy has quite a lot of them, and you can expect to see many of them on this list, but unfortunately most of them tend to be lighter on the funny. Once in a while, though, the show does both, and it's delightful to see, as we will be getting into later on in the list.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
This episode has all of the kids at the cul-de-sac under quarantine, causing Eddy to have a mental breakdown.
Back, chicken boy! Back! Back!
Hey, look!
Oh, dear.
Hey, find the nut! Where's the nut? Here's the nut, round you go! Come on, pick! This one, this. Ooh! Sorry, you lose!
Do I have to elaborate any more on why I like this episode? It's the most relatable shit I've ever seen. Alright, I'll give this one the full rundown. The season 1 of the Eds wasn't all that great. It took them to season 2 to really nail down their style of humor. And so, the first season was plagued by very awkward animation, characters that weren't very well developed, more stilted humor, and an over-reliance of using the cankers to end the plot. However, I didn't want to leave the first season off my list entirely, because there was a charm to it. There was always a charm to the awkward, inexperienced period of a show that eventually becomes good. And it's not like season 1 was bad, just not great. But even in the awkward freshman year of the Eds, there were a couple of gems. And I do mean a couple, like 3. I considered the hypnosis episode because I am a sucker for hypnosis plots, and how they can immediately change a character dynamic. Unfortunately, the episode ends with God Mode cankers, so I had to disqualify it from this list. And no, I'm not joking on that. It would be on this list if the cankers didn't end that plot. So my other 2 choices were Dawn of the Eds, you know, the episode where the Eds are all trying to get into an R-rated movie, and they get sidetracked in the junkyard where they have an adventure entirely in their imagination. It was definitely a charming episode in and of itself, but in the end, Laugh Ed Laugh is just funnier. And let me be very clear and show that this is actually beyond all irony, and I'm not just doing this to be whatever. I actually made my selections for my favorite and least favorite Eds episodes, like, last year. In 2019. That is when these videos were originally supposed to come out, before I got sidetracked. Kind of thinking now that I'm glad that I didn't pick that episode where the Eds broke the sky, because I don't want to know what kind of world it would be if I chose that one. There really isn't much that I can say, though, about this episode. Eddy's mental break is just funny. Surprisingly or not, it's rare when one of the Eds just goes completely off the deep end. The only other time I can think is Edliness is next to cleanliness, but you all know how I feel about that episode. This one works a lot better because, well, Eddy is going crazy because there's no kids to scam, and that's not exactly something he should be doing. Talking about how much I like this episode would probably devolve into me talking about jokes, which I don't want to do. It bores people who have seen it, and it would probably ruin the episode for those who hadn't seen it. But I can tell you what my favorite joke is. And that's when Eddy is so far gone that he ends up gambling with the squirrels. I don't know why, but that one just hits the spot, especially when Eddy shoves all of his winnings in his mouth. Despite having a tenuous relationship with reality, Ed and Eddy rarely got this absurd, but I kind of wish that it did more, because every single time it went for broke, it really, really did work. And yes, if you're wondering, over the course of 2020, I felt a lot more for this episode over the course of the year. If 2020 has made you go crazy, this might be the episode to watch. But watch WALL-E first, because it's clear to me that not enough people have seen WALL-E.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
At any rate, I balk at the result. Photomolecular dissipation.
Oh boy, what can I say about the Boomerang episode? It's perhaps one of the most memorable episodes of the entire series, although I feel like I'm saying that a lot in this video. This one is definitely up there in popularity, and it's a type of episode that really scratches my fancy. I like episodes that change up character dynamics a lot. It's why I'm a big fan of body swap episodes, but other types of this kind of thing work really well too, like personality swap, or even general role reversals. If you couldn't tell by the creative series that I work on, it's really hard to explain why I like them so much. Seeing characters act completely differently is, I don't want to say funny, but it is always interesting. You get to see a new light of who they are, and it completely changes what the show gets to be, at least for an episode. Although in this case, it isn't really an introspective showcase. It's just funny to see Jimmy become a muscle man temporarily, and very, very satisfying to see Kevin get crushed by a mailbox. When it came to personality swap type episodes, I did have 2 choices here. It was either this one or the Truth or Dare episode, and quite honestly, it was a hard as hell choice between the 2. Yeah, I know I could have put them both on my list, but I feel that it would be making for a far less interesting video if I was talking about the same type of episode again and again. Consider them a tie if you want, with me liking this one a little bit more. I have no idea why I was so harsh on the mystical elements in my Sorry Wrong End review, because in all honesty, except that one case, whenever mystical elements did sneak their way into the show, it gave things a unique flavor. I don't know why it's a boomerang of all things that changes up the personality of everyone. I don't know any symbolism or mythology that would make you consider that a boomerang, even a magical one, would have that power, but hey, it's all the more unique for breaking conventions. I think one of the reasons that I do like this episode more than the Truth or Dare episode is because the characters are being changed against their will, and that allows them to go a lot farther than they would have otherwise. In the Truth or Dare episode, they were at least in on it for the most part. In this one, nope, the boomerang changes you and you don't get a say. Hell, only Rolf seems to even notice the difference. It makes it a lot funnier for reasons that I can't entirely explain, although I can see a version of this episode where the kids seeked out the boomerang to gain its powers, especially for someone like Jimmy. This is just a weird one to explain for me. That might be why it's so low on this list. I'm not exactly having the easiest time justifying it or explaining why I like this episode so much. All I can really say is that I do, because I like this kind of plot. In my own concepts and such, I usually try as hard as I can to have at least one episode like this, when all of the characters are well established enough for it to work properly.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
Ed! You listen to me, mister! You can't kick me out! I live here too!
So move!
Little Ed Blue, this one is a classic. This is the one where Ed's having a bad day and he gets, let's say, a little bit upset. And by a little upset, I mean he goes on a fucking rampage. It's one of the more obvious choices on my list. It is one of the most memorable episodes of Ed, Edd n Eddy there is, and it's easy to see why. In my top 10 worst episode list, I said that all of the characters were assholes. People use Double D and Ed to say that that wasn't true, but to that I point you to Sorry Wrong Ed and the Halloween special, respectively. But I will concede that Ed is definitely, usually the nicest character there is on the show. And it is definitely out of the ordinary to see him in such a state that he's in this episode. And I mean, it's probably a good thing for everyone involved that Ed is one of the nicer characters, because if he wasn't, everyone else in the show would be dead. Unless they already are, if you believe stupid creepypastas.
Touch me again and I will squash you!
Yeah, Ed just kinda threatened to kill Double D. Now, that's a moment. Ed's delivery throughout this episode just really works. It makes everything that he's ever said absolutely hilarious. The tension in this episode is incredible, and they do amazing things with the visuals. Speaking of which, I don't think I'm ever gonna forget the joke about the magazine that Ed hides under his pillow. I don't think I can forget that joke. It's a top 5 joke on the show.
It's a magazine! Ed's been holding out on us! Chicks galore, huh?
I didn't even know they had magazines like that.
Seriously. Considering how long I've been on the internet and what I know now, if magazines like that don't exist, there's an untapped market for magazines like that. The comic book gag isn't far behind either. This episode, though, I could list them all, but this episode is just gag after gag after gag, and they all really work. I could just name them all. Like, Ed's flamethrower toy. That's another really good one. The only reason this episode is so low on my list is because of how many times I've seen it, and heard people talk about it. It's good to know that overplay has an effect, like, decades in the future, but it really just can't even undercut how amazing this episode is. I don't think there's a down moment throughout the whole thing. Like, some of the best episodes of Ed, Edd n Eddy have something like too slow of a beginning or an anticlimactic ending. Like, for example, 1 + 1 = Ed has a pretty slow beginning, and the Canadian Squirt Gun episode has a pretty anticlimactic end. But this one manages to avoid all of those traps. Well, it does have an anticlimax, but by God, is it a beautiful anticlimax. I'd keep going on and on about this one, but to be honest, you've probably heard it before. And for a reason. Honestly, if you could see no other episode of Ed, Edd n Eddy, I'd suggest seeing this one, really.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
I say we call the cops!
What number do you dial for 911?
Remember what I said in the worst list about the Cankers? It was something along the lines of them being some of the worst excuses for characters in any cartoon that I had ever seen, and that they were along the lines of just lazy tools for ending the episodes when the writers got stuck and didn't know how to properly end their stories. I also said that in 99.9% of the time, they didn't just make an episode worse, but in a way they actively ruined it. Well, there's actually one exception to this rule. The 0.1% of the time where they actually enhanced the episode. Run for Your Ed is my favorite Kanker appearance for sure. If you don't know, it's the episode where Ed sleepwalks into the Cankers' trailer and accidentally ends up getting their ship in a bottle stuck on his finger. And when the Cankers figure this out, they go on a literal rampage all around the cul-de-sac, destroying it with apocalyptic force. Quite honestly, I'm just a sucker for these end-of-the-world style scenarios. I love the tension and what it makes the characters go through. Honestly, it feels fitting that the Cankers are treated as some unstoppable force of nature, something that you can't fight, and you know that you can't fight, so your only real option is to run and hide and hope it doesn't get to you, even though you know that it will. While Ed, Eddy has a hard time with things like humiliation, it is great whenever it tries tension. Tension is all in the mood, it's all emotion, and that is where the show excels. So many times through the episode, the Cankers come closer and closer to the Eds, as they just manage to dodge being tackled by the Cankers, completely unknowing what waits for them. The comedy as a whole is definitely on the lighter side for this episode, but it has one centerpiece joke that gets me every single time. It's when Double D answers the door to find the Cankers, and then he realizes that they're after the ship in the bottle that is currently stuck to Ed's fingers. Sound design is such an important part of Ed, and Eddy, and hearing the heartbeat progressively get faster and faster as Ed just gently closes and then locks the door before freaking completely out. It just works in the best of ways. It's up there with some of the show's best gags. I don't know why it's not as famous as something like Zappity Zap Zap, but it should be, and it all ends up building to a beautiful anticlimax that really ends the episode well.
My best friend Plank, my best friend Plank, my best friend Plank.
Flipping through the fuzz of our belly button existence.
We're gonna rule this dump it!
The full half-hour episodes of Ed, and Eddy tend to be more than a little bit controversial. One of the most infamous episodes of the show is If It Smells Like an Ed, because Jimmy is an asshole and the Eds lose at the end, despite not deserving to, which has never happened in any other episode of the show. It's never happened before. Hell, I even put the Halloween episode on my worst list, and the Christmas episode has a few issues in and of itself. So, when I put a 22-minute episode on this best list, I do consider it to be my most controversial pick. And that episode is A Fistful of Ed. A Fistful of Ed is an episode that a lot of people don't like. If you don't remember it, it's the episode where, due to a contrived set of circumstances, Double D accidentally becomes the school bully.
We talking will get you everywhere.
Hey, what's your game, mister?
You sent a canker packing? What'd you use? The deadly art of allergies?
Because, yeah, Double D gets a lot of shit in this episode that he doesn't deserve. So, I am going to have to put up a good defense here, because there are definitely things to not like. Unlike It Smells Like an Ed, the story here isn't especially strong. It takes a lot of cheating and shortcuts to make Double D look like the school bully. However, what we got in the end is a funny premise, and it gets a lot of mileage out of making one of the most meek characters on the show look like the school bruiser. The slapstick is definitely on form in this episode, but when all said and done, it isn't the most funny episode of the show by any means. No, this episode is unique because it is uniquely endearing, as opposed to any other episode of the show. Throughout this episode, you do feel for Double D more and more as his entire world crumbles around him. It really does hurt when Ed says that he can't be friends with Double D anymore. You feel it, man. And no other episode of the show makes you feel so hardly for these characters. And I gotta say, even though this isn't the funniest episode ever, the Double G bit is really funny. What you might not know is that this was the last episode of Season 5, and Season 6 wasn't certain at the time. In the end, Season 6 got a single episode and the Alien special. So, in a way, this episode is a finale to cap the entire show. It even has a few callbacks, most notably Eddy referencing the sumo episode. And yeah, Eddy's behavior here is another critique, but what puts this episode as one of my favorites is the ending. After Double D gets beaten up by Jimmy, all of the Eds are able to reunite finally, now that he isn't seen as a bully. And Eddy does lose his jacket, so it's not like he gets no punishment at all. But beyond all of that, Eddy, of all people, manages to tell the Cankers, of all people, off. That moment, knowing what we know about Eddy, like, you can really only know how significant that moment is if you've seen the entire show. Like, all the times that Eddy has sold out his friends for his own benefit. It is a major character moment.
He's had enough already! Beat it!
So I'm putting this episode on my list as an ending of sorts. And yes, the movie is a very good ending as well. But shows that do have finale movies also do tend to have finale episodes as well. And Ed, Edd, and Eddy has actually had a few, but I think this is the best of them all. And it's a really good entry in that category.
Oh, Ed!
Double D!
Yeah, Double D.
Eddy! You standing up to a cliche show ending for me.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
You are accused of shirking the responsibility of an older brother. What do you have to say for yourself, young man? Has the jury reached a verdict?
Oh God, this episode. What can be said about this episode? Rockabye Ed is the episode where Ed becomes afraid of Johnny, and my God, it is one of the funniest cartoon episodes, not just of this show, but funniest that I have ever seen. Most of this episode really pushes forward Ed's expressions and reactions, and he has the best of them in the entire series. What makes this episode is just seeing his reactions through the entire thing. Literally tying himself in knots to get away from Johnny, with Johnny being none the wiser of what the hell is going on. I could just list every single thing out of Ed's mouth this entire episode as to why I like it, as jokes that are just hit after hit after hit. Just about every single second of this episode is completely on point. But Ed isn't the funniest thing about this episode. Do you know why Ed is scared of Johnny in this episode? Well, Ed has a dream. In that dream, he gets Sarah mad, and Sarah goes to tell their mom. Just seeing what appears to be an adult in the world of Ed, Edd, and Eddy is a surreal enough feeling. Like, this is something that was never on the show prior. But what pushes this over the top is that Ed's mom just so happens to be Johnny. This is one of the most batshit, bizarre, crazy ideas that I've ever seen. And to be quite honest with you, I just love it. It's obviously not the strangest episode of the show, but in a way, it is the strangest episode of the show. Episodes like the Boomerang episode or 1 + 1 = Ed have multiple strange ideas, but this one just has this one strange idea and it sticks with it. It runs with it, keeping it one of the strongest episodes in the entire series. I don't know if this episode gets as much love as Little Ed Blue or Dawn of the Eds, because it really, really should. It's a miniature masterpiece here.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
Why, we're up! Super up! You did it, Lumpy!
Is this what you did all day, Ed?
I was making up Double D.
This is as up as you can get, Ed!
Thank you very much.
To be honest with you, this was the hardest choice on the list for me to justify, especially with my criticism towards other episodes like the Teen Titans Go episode, Waffles. Most of They Call Him Mr. Ed is about the characters saying the same word up over and over again. And I mean, up is not necessarily a funny word, and them saying it over and over again doesn't make it any funnier. But for me, this just so happens to be one of the most memorable episodes of the whole show. And trust me, I really wish that I could articulate why this episode is so memorable. I guess because it works exactly like a meme does. It's just something that draws attention to itself, so it latches onto your brain. I sound like I'm insulting this episode, so let's swerve to what I love about this episode. And I think it's one of the funniest episodes of the entire show. Not the absolute funniest, we've still got 2 episodes to go, but it's still really funny in its own right. There are things like Ed finding his own special way through the maze, going up the elevator and crashing back down, and running into an invisible wall. I'm gonna be honest, it's mostly Ed here. He has so many background gags for the entire episode, and he's really the MVP here. Beyond that, though, I like how many up puns they're able to cram into 11 minutes. Ed, Edd, and Eddy doesn't delve into verbal humor all that often, so it definitely helps this episode stand out a lot more. This episode doesn't make much logical sense, but I think I'm okay with that. Eddy decides he wants to go up, and then he and the other cul-de-sac kids start playing like they're in a giant corporation with no real stakes. Honestly, I think I might like this episode because it's so charming. This episode doesn't have any scam, it's just really kids being kids and playing around. If there's any episode here I call a guilty pleasure, this one might be it. But when it comes to Ed, Edd, and Eddy, this is one of the episodes that I end up thinking about the most, and I enjoy watching it every single time.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
This is fun!
Alright, now it's time to talk about the most famous episode of Ed, Edd, and Eddy. Even if you've never watched the show, You've probably heard of 1 + 1 = Ed, and for a good reason. While Ed, Edd n Eddy definitely isn't as down-to-earth as some cartoons from that era, it did relatively stick to its own reality. There were constant laws of physics and a world that it usually adhered to, only breaking it for a joke here and there. In this episode, though, they put all of that to the side. This entire episode is just a trip, plain and simple. The episode is about the Eds trying to take things apart and learn how it works, and eventually it has them taking apart their entire reality. This episode knows that it's a cartoon and does everything it can think of to take advantage of that fact. There are plenty of classic gags, like portable holes, perspective tricks, and let's say, reinterpretation of the characters. Even before reality breaks apart completely in this episode, it starts off with a lot of memorable gags. I don't know if this is sacrilege to say, but Ed eating Eddy's lava lamp will probably always be one of my favorite gags in the episode. I don't know why, it's just so ridiculous it makes me laugh. I suppose that's an interesting thing. As far as actual comedy, while there is plenty of jokes in this episode that do make me laugh and work very well, there aren't really any that stand out as all-time classics in this episode. You know, this one doesn't have a zappity zap zap or a Barano beef dip. Fun fact, Barano beef dip is my favorite gag in the entire show. And I did want to place on this list as is. Unfortunately, the episode it found itself in was dull as dishwater, and would probably be taking Tinker Ed's place if not for that one gem of a joke. This episode, though, instead of really relying too much on the comedy, it just goes for spectacle and surrealism. While I can't say it's as funny as other episodes, this one is continually visually interesting, and each frame is memorable. Ed, Edd n Eddy is a show that takes place in a very limited world. They have about a dozen characters and only a few locations that they regularly visit, never really traveling outside of them. It's just so refreshing seeing them tackle scenery straight on out of Wonderland. And as I learn more about animation, I do admire this episode more and more, as it plays on typical tropes that define what a cartoon is. They do things like playing with the character's outline, rev running, and all of that kind of stuff. The only thing that ever did bug me about this episode was the ending, where just out of nowhere with no explanation are the Eds placed back in reality. It's never made exactly clear what happened. I could imagine that it only happened in the illusions of Ed as he struggled to comprehend any of what was going on around him, but the other Eds seemed to be just as in on the world around them as Ed was throughout the whole thing. Either way, it could have been made more clear. Honestly, this episode reminds me a lot of what The Amazing World of Gumball would eventually become. It's a cartoon that not only knew it was a cartoon, but it played around with a lot of the tropes that you'd find in your typical TV show or animation, such as reruns, retconning, and having uninteresting characters disappear into the ether. While it never went as balls to the walls as this one particular episode, it's definitely something to watch if you want to see more of this kind of thing, especially the later seasons of Gumball. And despite this episode's well-earned reputation, I just couldn't justify putting it at number 1 on my own particular list. Yeah, it's really great and it's really interesting, but I think the problem is how different it is. And that holds me back from considering it the best episode of Ed, Edd n Eddy. I mean, it feels kind of wrong saying that the best episode of a show is unlike any of the other episodes of the show. In my opinion, the best episode of the show is one that takes what the show does best, and does it better than any other episode. And in my opinion, there is only one episode that fits the bill here. Let's do this.
My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank. My best friend Plank.
Hey, look, it's our husbands!
Just in time to play house!
Gankers! Extreme close-up!
I feel a bit odd for revealing my favorite Ed, Edd n Eddy episode. Not because I think it's bad, obviously. I don't even think this one is unpopular. It's not like If It Smells Like an Ed or anything like that. But I don't usually see people point to this as one of the show's all-time best. Like I said, most people point to 1 + 1 = Ed, or Once Upon an Ed, or even Take This Ed and Shove It. My favorite episode is Don't Rain on My Ed. If you don't remember, this is the episode where it's Customer Appreciation Day at the candy store, and they're giving away free Jawbreakers. Quite honestly, I do think that this is the best episode of the show, and it's one that I would use to introduce people to the show so they can experience what it's really all about. Don't Rain on My Ed isn't especially strange like 1 + 1. It's actually fairly typical for an Ed, Edd n Eddy episode, following the traditional formula. The Eds doing whatever they can do to get a Jawbreaker. What is different is how well that this episode excels within the formula of Ed, Edd and Eddy. The episode never lets up on the pressure. It's constantly engaging. A lot of episodes have down moments, and I will say that the beginning of this episode isn't too interesting, but as soon as the Eds learn that they're giving away free job breakers, but there's only 10 minutes to actually get them, the race is on. I love the tension here as the Eds get increasingly desperate to get to the candy store in time, and fate gets increasingly desperate to keep that from happening. There are a lot of chase-style episodes of Ed, Edd and Eddy. Mission Ed Possible is another one. And while this is another unpopular opinion, I like that episode too because this formula really does speak to me. What sets this one apart, though, is just all of the gags throughout it. And yeah, in a comedy show, my favorite episode is probably going to come down to the gags. I could really list them all. With pacing so fast, the episode doesn't really have time to linger on anything, so it goes through set piece after set piece, and each scene has something new. Even when they're tempted to argue and complain about what happened, which can slow an episode down, the Eds realize the time's running out and they've got to go. I love the climax here. It's probably one of my favorites in the entire series. It looks like they'll make it to the candy store when a huge torrential storm comes to stop them. Then Ed gets really determined, and it almost looks like they're going to make it once again, when the most random thing possible happens. A chicken drive, and that is the most perfect thing to stop Ed from getting there. It's a diabolus ex machina for sure, but I think it works because the entire episode is conspired against them. This episode ain't about the destination, it's about the journey, which was hilarious. Not to mention, Eddy kinda deserves to get the door slammed in his face for abandoning his friends multiple times throughout the entire episode. And that is my top 10 favorite episodes of Ed, Edd and Eddy. And I have to admit that this list was a lot harder than I actually thought it would be. Not just because I'm trying to speak about the intricacies of a comedy show. And I don't think that makes much sense to many people. Like, when I did Nick's Admirable Animations, people told me that I needed to be positive, or I'd get jaded, or I wouldn't want to do YouTube anymore. And I'm going to say that that's completely and objectively wrong. Making positive videos is what makes me not want to do YouTube anymore. Not only do I have a harder time articulating why I like something, but to make reviews about things I like, they end up being a uphill slog. Especially when the people who want to see those tend to be louder about it. And when enough people ask me to do something, I have this personality quirk that makes me not want to do it ever. Meanwhile, being able to rant about something stupid Family Guy has done helps me stay sane. I've said it before, but it's catharsis, and I find it a lot more mentally engaging to figure out the intricacies of why something doesn't work. It's the difference between putting together a jigsaw puzzle and looking at a jigsaw puzzle that's already complete. To me, there really is no point at looking at the jigsaw puzzle that's already complete. There's nothing for me there. I feel that when a cartoon or a story or anything is working completely fine, you don't need me or my skills or whatever. If you want to see me jaded, it would honestly be me making nothing but lists like this. I can certainly do it occasionally, but I think it has to be an occasional thing. The saddest part of all of this is that despite a ton of people asking me for Admirable Animations or my top 10 cartoons of various decades, whenever I am positive, it gets shit for views. You'd never ever guess if you just go by the comments in my other videos. I actually had to enlist the first part of my top 10 advertising campaigns because I got more people asking me for part 2 than actually watched part 1. This is probably an exaggeration, but it really does feel like I got more people asking me for part 2 than actually watched part 1. It was one of the lowest performing videos that I had ever made. I had made random update videos that got more views. Yet what you have to understand is making these videos actually costs me. It costs me editing money, and it costs me time. It's a very bad move for me to spend time and money on something that isn't going to get me any views, unless I'm getting something else out of it, like I did with Technocracy. I can't make a career on doing that. And if you asked any business person, making part 2 of the top 10 advertising campaigns would be an abysmally stupid move. This is not to harp on the people who actually wanted to see that. Like, I'm not blaming anybody for wanting to see specific content. That's all fine and great, and I like the people who do like Admirable Animations, and especially the ones who don't hound me about making more and more. If you do want to see more content about that, I do have a suggestion that would mutually benefit the both of us. If you want to see more videos of a specific style, like any type of content that I make on this channel, instead of asking me when is the next part, am I ever going to make the next part, or saying it's been X many days since Admirable Animations, all that's going to do is nothing except make it unlikely that you'll ever get something like that. If you want to see more of a certain type of content, and I don't just mean this with my videos, any videos at all from any YouTuber. What you've got to do is watch those videos. But beyond that, you have to like and share them and make sure other people watch them too. So it's actually, beneficial for the YouTuber to make more of those videos. Like, this goes beyond me. I've seen a lot of people who could have become very successful YouTubers give up because they didn't get enough audience encouragement. Let me promise you this. No one posts to YouTube for their own health. That would be an abysmally stupid idea. That would be one of the most stupid ideas I can imagine. And I'm sorry if this ending chat got a little bit too negative, and I understand that this isn't the most appropriate place for it, but it is something that I think I had to address because it has been getting out of hand for quite some time now. I know that this is unpopular to say, a real YouTuber is never ever supposed to say this, but views really do dictate what happens on this channel. Honestly, it dictates what happens on most channels. To a certain extent, obviously. There's always going to be someone who has a passion project that they don't really care about the views, but you can't make a career off of that. It's views and engagement that pay the bills. And for many of us, this is our job. You might not like that it's our job, and you might not respect that it's our job, but it is our job, and we need to treat it like our job if we want to continue doing this. And on that note, if I just let what people directly ask me for direct what I do, well, even in 2020, I'd still be reviewing episodes of Friendship is Magic.